Good afternoon and welcome to the Batchelor Society on Tom Lehrer, Peter Cook and the Satire boom. Hope you've washed your hands before you start listening to this. If you're not, go away, wash them immediately. Okay, so here we are. These days, not these days in particular, but generally in this part of human history, people are used to laughing at their governments. Political satire is everywhere. I'm writing this on a Wednesday evening, and if I was watching TV instead of writing this, then there's quite a few things I could have chosen to watch. I could, for instance, be watching Have I Got News for You? Political satire. I could be watching Mock the Week. I could be watching Yes Minister, either the older version, as pictured here, or the remade for a new audience with new political satire. I could watch the MASH report, or didn't want to watch any of them. I could find a DVD of Spitting Image, or Brass Eye, or The Thick of It, or Veep. In short, no end to political satire. In fact, in a very sort of postmodern twist, politics itself now seems to be satirizing political satire, and you have bizarre schizophrenic tweets from Donald Trump. I gave up trying to make these ultra-modern because every time I sat down to find schizophrenic tweets from Donald Trump, he did some more. So I've just gone with two very obvious ones. And indeed, in Britain, you have this image of our Prime Minister. Difficult to imagine Clement Attlee doing that. Okay, so this notion of mocking the rich and powerful, this humorous, deliberately humorous exaggeration of the power that they hold, is satire, and it's a relatively modern phenomenon. If you're a literary scholar, you could probably point to bits in the Canterbury Tales, which are considered satirical, and in fact, if you're a classicist, you could go back to at least the 1st century AD with Petronius and point out that Trimalchio's picnic in Satyricon is clearly satire. But it's actually only with the invention of cheap and easily accessible media like records, magazines, radio, and television that satire moved into the mainstream. And the intention today is to talk to you about two individuals who contributed a great deal to moving satire into the mainstream in the 1960s, when Britain experienced something called a satire boom. The irony is that I've just said, oh, look, it moved mainstream and it's mass media that makes it possible. But neither of these two individuals had what we might consider a mainstream upbringing, both from very elite style backgrounds, certainly in terms of their education. In Britain, Peter Cook graduated from Pembroke College, Cambridge, with a degree in French and German. And in America, Tom Lehrer was at Harvard. And what makes it even more impressive is he was at Harvard aged 15, being some sort of mathematical genius. I'm going to deal with Peter Cook first. And if you Google Peter Cook, you'll find that he's listed simply as a comedian. And actually references abound on the internet to Peter Cook's work with a person called Dudley Moore. And in fact, if you're still in lockdown, you could probably spend some time looking at some of their more famous sketches. They did a whole series of things called the Dagenham Dialogues, which featured two working class men, Peter Cook there on the left, Dudley Moore on the right, just known as Pete and Dud, talking about what was going on in their lives. If you're familiar with Thunderbirds, you could look up Peter Cook's Super Thundersting car parody, and he made another character as well called Sir Arthur Streeb Greebling, very famous sketch called The Frog and Peach. So it's certainly true that he was a comedian, but I think just calling him a comedian masks a massive contribution that he made to what we now take for granted, which is the idea that we are able to mock our leaders. He graduated from Cambridge, and then he toured as part of a group called Beyond the Fringe. Dudley Moore was in there, Alan Bennett was a member of Beyond the Fringe, and Jonathan Miller was the fourth member, along with Peter Cook. And Peter Cook wrote two sketches in particular which stood out in Beyond the Fringe and really helped move satire forward. One of them was called The Aftermath of the War, and at one point Cook is an air commander, and he calls in a pilot played by Jonathan Miller, and he says, "Now then, Perkins, the war's not going well." And Perkins says, "Oh dear, I thought we were winning." He says, "Well, yes, we are, but you know how it is, how In a football game, Perkins, often 10 men play better than 11. And Perkins says, well, yes. And Peter Cook says, we need you to be that 11th man. Get in a plane and fly over to Bremen. We need a futile gesture at this point, so get shot down and don't come back. Bye-bye, Perkins. And Perkins agrees. He says, but perhaps it's not goodbye, it's just au revoir. And Peter Cook's character looks him dead in the eye and says, no, Perkins, it's goodbye. And you may or may not find that particularly amusing, but the point is, what's the subject of that satire? The subject is the Second World War, and this is being performed in about 1959, 1960. So it's mocking the generation above, and it's mocking their achievements in something which was pretty phenomenally strong-willed, which they did. It's the first time that anyone had really taken the Second World War and subjected it to anything other than sort of a reverence, really, for the people who participated in it. He made, in that one sketch, he made mocking an older generation a legitimate avenue for comedy. And given that it's the older generations who tend to be in charge, that opened up the door for satire. The other sketch which he did, which went still further, took aim at the Prime Minister at the time, Harold Macmillan. I don't think Cook had anything in particular against Macmillan at this point, but he did do this stand-up routine where he pretended to be Macmillan and generally came across as sort of bumbling, ineffective, not really knowing what was going on. It created waves, and at one point, Macmillan himself actually went to see Peter Cook being Macmillan to show that he could, take a joke, and it was all in good humor and whatever. But Peter Cook spotted him in the audience and began to deviate from his planned performance and just sort of ad-libbed about how terrible Macmillan was, including the line, there's nothing better I like of an evening than to go to a theatre and sit there with a big stupid grin on my face while someone insults me. You don't get much more satirical than actually humiliating the Prime Minister in front of him. So again, new avenues being opened up. Now, one or two sketches don't actually make you a satirist, even if they happen to be satirical. And a veteran comedian, Barry Cryer, is not a satirist at all. He was more of a nonsense performer. He just did silly things which made no sense. And this is true if you look at certain characters like E.L. Whisty, who was this other character of Peter Cook's. E.L. Whisty, utterly convinced of bizarre conspiracy theories, including one where the Nazis had trained ants to eat people, but they would eat you really slowly. And they also had coagulant on their jaws so that you didn't bleed and you got eaten away just to a skeleton, but you were still alive. And yeah, so it's true that E.L. Whisty does sort of strengthen that argument that no, he's just a humorist. But what that doesn't recognize is that in 1961, Peter Cook did two things which really helped kickstart satire as a mainstream institution. One was he founded a nightclub called The Establishment, which, as you can see there, is London's first satirical nightclub. So it's sort of like a comedy club, but with political satire as the vehicle for comedy. And the other thing that he did was he founded Private Eye. Same year, 1961, Private Eye founded. So whilst he might not have been a satirist, his contribution to satire in the 20th century is probably bigger than any other individual in the UK. In fact, if we do a sort of spider diagram, there's Peter Cook. A big name in satire after Peter Cook moved away from it was David Frost. But David Frost found fame performing on stage at The Establishment. So he owed his big breaks to Peter Cook. By the end of the 80s, David Frost wasn't a satirist anymore, and the sort of key satirist was probably Chris Morris. But Chris Morris's early break as a comedic broadcaster was a series of interviews with Peter Cook entitled Why Bother? And when Peter Cook got these interviews with Chris Morris got recognized as a talented individual, and then Chris Morris got the series The Day to Day, and he employed Armando Iannucci, who is in turn now the creator of In the Loop, In the Thick of It, and he also directed Death of Stalin. So a massive amount of sort of satirical connections there. And of course, the daddy of all satire programs in the UK is Have I Got News for You? And one of the team captains in Have I Got News for You is Ian Hislop, whose other job, as well as being a team captain, is the editor of Private Eye, which he's been since 1986. And of course, Private Eye, founded by Peter Cook. So you can't ignore Peter Cook, even if you don't want to call him a satirist. He's certainly contributed to satire. Moving across to America, the story of how American satire took off was slightly different. Tom Lehrer was born in 1928, still alive, recently turned 92. Don't know where he's living at the minute, probably somewhere in Massachusetts. He was never a satirist either. What he did was he went off to Harvard and he wrote songs for his own entertainment. By his own account, he only wrote about 30 to 40 of them. I think he counted 37 at one point. And they're not really satirical in and of themselves, but he used to perform them at parties. Broadly speaking, they fall into three groups. One are just sort of comedy songs. I'm not going to play you comedy songs because, frankly, I lack the technological ability to do that. But the comedic songs are things like I Got It From Agnes, things like Poisoning Pigeons in the Park. There's a fair few of these kicking about. You can find them all in the description of this talk, actually, on YouTube, or I'll put them in the comments if I can't put them in the description. Anyway, these songs are just comedic. I mean, if you read either of them, you can see that they're just sort of silly ideas or slightly risque, depending on what you think it is. The second group does parody and does satirize, but is non-political in its targeting. So, for instance, in America in the 50s, which is when Lehrer was writing, there was a style of song which eulogized certain members of the community, the noble, the fine sort of the backbone of America, the farmer, songs about the guys who worked for the chambers of commerce. I'm not making any of this up. The old lamplighter was one, sort of the guy who lit the gas lamps, and the song about the old gas lamplighter was, if he would light the lamps, but if he saw a wooing couple, he'd turn the lamp down low so that it would all be very romantic for them. Tom Lehrer decided to satirize that particular model, and he did so with the old dope peddler, which was his version of it. He also did the Elements song, which satirizes Gilbert and Sullivan's I Am the Very Model of a Modern Major General. And he also satirized the folk song Clementine, which I can't put a quote on the PowerPoint presentation from Clementine because it's impossible, but he does 4 different verses to Clementine, all in different styles, including one which satirizes Mozart, one which satirizes Gilbert and Sullivan, and so on. But the largest selection of his songs were ones that made a political point. Now, you've got to remember that when Tom Lehrer is writing, the US is experiencing a huge amount of social tension, social unrest. There's a lot of you guys will know this. Obviously, there's serious issues over race. There's quite a lot of issues over gender. There's issues over religion. And what Tom Lehrer tried to do was draw attention to these through songs. So you had I Want to Go Back to Dixie, you had the Vatican Rag, and you had National Brotherhood Week, all of which pointed out the failings, let's say, of the United States and the way it was working. But unlike Cook, who was trying to make a point, through his sketch, he deliberately wrote these things to sort of take the establishment down a couple of notches. Tom Lehrer was not really doing it for those reasons. He liked mucking about with music. He liked making people laugh. And he found that this was what entertained people. So, as I say, he went to parties, he performed the songs, people kept asking him to perform them. So eventually he recorded them and sold the records rather than performing them live. And then he ended up being nationally famous. And soon he was working with a transatlantic satirical project called That Was the Week That Was. And this really opened up the door to his later wave satire, which included songs about government policy, government initiatives, and so on. Probably the most famous one at the time being a song called Werner von Braun. Werner von Braun points out that American ingenuity and know-how in rocketry and space travel seemed to rather neatly correlate with the number of ex-Nazi rocket scientists who had been kidnapped from Germany at the end of World War II. Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Werner von Braun. But unlike Cook, Lehrer isn't mocking just those at the top. He also, in his satirical approach took aim at those at the bottom. When you watch Peter Cook's sketches, he plays one of two types of character. He plays the common working man who you find absurd, but you have sympathy with. Or he plays an upper class man whom you find absurd and have no sympathy with at all. Tom Lehrer doesn't do that. He mocks the upper, but he also mocks the lower. Everything's futile for Lehrer. There's an overarching sense of despair in a positive way, if you can have a positive overarching sense of despair. You've got songs like the folk song Army, which mocks the evolving hippie movement, for instance. They have a "We will all go together when we go. We're all going to die in a nuclear war, so who cares?" kind of approach. So you had two completely different types of approaches here, and American satire never really took a side. It was everything was wrong, whereas British satire generally tend to be sort of fought on behalf of the working man. Okay, so what happened to Cook and Lehrer? Well, Peter Cook basically became mainstream. He became a comedic actor. Some of his best-known roles, I would say, are actually when he does continue political satire. I get the impression he was given a lot of leeway in some of the roles he took to develop them in his own way. But we have here him as a judge in The Secret Policeman's Ball, parodying the judicial summary of the Jeremy Thorpe case. I know some of you have seen that. On the right, there is a Sir Mortimer Crisp in Whoops Apocalypse, playing a Conservative Prime Minister utterly brilliantly. If you ever find the Whoops Apocalypse sketches, they're worth seeing. And then at the bottom, and I don't know why he did this, because Macmillan had probably stopped caring, but with great timing, Macmillan dies in 86, and in 85, Peter Cook dresses up as Macmillan again, aged, as an 83-year-old, and goes on and impersonates him once more, ending up just sort of gently mocking. I don't know whether Cook felt that he hadn't, got the last word in their original encounter, but he for some reason decided to resurrect Macmillan or his Macmillan character and humiliate him again. Tom Lehrer, on the other hand, just gave up, walked away. I'm not sure why this is, because Lehrer himself has given lots of alternative reasons why it might have happened. But I think one thing is that because American satire did aim at everyone and everything, it's very difficult to know where he would have gone next. Within a few years, he'd mocked the rich and the poor, the powerful and the powerless, those who make the decisions and those who have to tolerate them. I'm not sure what he's going to do after that. It's worth pointing out that Lehrer himself never claimed that was a reason for giving up on satire. The reasons he's given are he got bored. His interest lay elsewhere. He was a mathematical genius, or possibly remains a mathematical genius. Touring, he said, was tedious. He was always doing the same songs and it was getting boring. The only things he has said about his retirement was a couple of rumors were circulating. One was that after publishing the Wernher von Braun song, a legal ruling required him to give all royalties to Wernher von Braun, so he stopped touring in order to not generate any royalties. And the other thing was he didn't retire after Henry Kissinger, who was one of Nixon's top advisors in the White House, organized the bombing of Cambodia. An apocryphal story circulated that Lehrer apparently sort of read about the bombing of Cambodia and said, political satire is now obsolete. I think probably the truest explanation, though, is the one he gave some years later. He said, hang on, that's Henry Kissinger, did not bomb Cambodia and therefore caused Lehrer to retire. Tom Lehrer said that the problem now is that satire is obsolete, not because of Lehrer, not because of Kissinger, but because of the politicians themselves. As I said at the beginning of this talk, politicians satirize themselves to the point where it's now beyond mockery. You don't need to point out the problems with Trump and Johnson because they're so apparent. And relatively recently, Tom was asked, why don't you do satire anymore? And he said, in America now, asking an American for satire is a little bit like asking a resident of Pompeii for some humorous observations about lava. So to conclude, the satire boom of the 1960s event. Yes, it was pretty short-lived. And like other social phenomena, it flowered briefly but very vividly. I'm thinking of things like maybe, the Harlem Shake, vuvuzelas, Tamagotchi, that weird period of time where Fellaini was considered to be a really, really good footballer. But unlike any of those, it hasn't gone away. What's actually happened is that satire has become absorbed into the public consciousness. The marketplace for satire now is actually incredibly crowded, which means, I guess, that the impact of any individual piece of satire is quite a lot less. I mean, Have I Got News for You and Private Eye are nowhere near as popular as they were at their peak, possibly because if you don't want to watch Have I Got News for You, you can watch programs, but also because comedy, which is an important part of satire, has moved in a rather different direction. I think a lot of comedy at the minute is essentially Mr. Bean, but with dialogue. We'll do another Bachelor Society on this maybe, but suffice to say it's all Ricky Gervais's fault. But the point is that even if you don't read satire or watch satire, you think satirically. The satire boom achieved a huge shift in the public mentality. Yes, the governing class is a different group from most of us, but they are no longer seen as a group beyond questioning. They're not seen as a superior group. And that shift was the satire boom then was basically. Thank you for listening. If you're bored, you can go away and look up some stuff by Lehrer and Cook. I'll try to put the descriptions in there, to put the links in there somewhere, so you broaden your minds. I'm not necessarily endorsing any of these things, but they are culturally significant. This is being streamed as a premiere, so as you've probably already discovered, there is a chat feature. I will attempt to hang around on the chat feature if I can, and you could all ask me any questions that you might have. But of course, first, go and wash your hands again. Thank you. Bye-bye.